Sir George Bach lived from around 1560 to 1622 and worked for both Elizabeth I and James I. He wrote a book entitled The History of Richard III, a first draft of which was completed in 1619, just 3 years before his death, which will be important. He probably later on added some more, but the specifics are hard to reconstruct. His work made Bach the first public defender of the Yorkist King, and strangely fitting, his life, which had already been exciting up to that point, was to take a tragically dramatic turn, which fits strangely coherently with the time of Richard III. Bach's life story is full of unexpected twists and turns. Bach was born as the son of a churchman. He chose not to follow his father's example and instead wanted to devote himself to the love of books and history. His family was personally affected by Richard III's fate. It stood with him at Bosworth and lost most of its fortune as a result. It would have lost all if the famous and very influential Howard family hadn't intervened on its behalf. Bach became an archivist and historian, but politics had also piqued his interest. The Englishman entered Parliament and fought for his homeland against the Spanish Armada in 1588. By now, at the latest, he had earned the highest respect. After recommendation of his commanding officer Charles Lord Howard, the High Admiral of England, Queen Elizabeth I took him into her own services. Bach took over legations for her government. One of them was to Cadiz in 1596. It was very important, which highlights the trust the Queen had into Bach. We have one letter of recommendation for Bach by the Admiral, but it is for another position and to another person. You can see it on the screen. In 1593 and 1597, Bach was a member of Parliament. Bach wrote its own Latin poem to celebrate the victory over the Spanish fleet. Its English title is The Battle of the Black Eagle of Austria and the White Lion of Norfolk, or the victory of the most illustrious, worthy Charles Howard under the divine auspices of our Diana. In 1597, the Queen had promised the archivist and historian a new job. Bach was to become master of the revels as soon as the post would become available. He would thus be responsible for all plays performed in royal palaces or in the presence of the Queen. He would also be the censor of all plays before they were shown in public theatres. This would also make him the supervisor of William Shakespeare's plays. It should be noted that in 1597 the first printed version of Richard III appeared, which had been premiered 4 years earlier. The current office holder was Bach's uncle Edmund Tilney. He himself served as his deputy and was therefore a logical choice. Mark Eccles judged in 1933 that this nomination nevertheless demonstrated that the Queen genuinely liked Bach. But before Bach could engage with Shakespeare's and other dramas, he had to survive the drama of his nomination. A playwright named John Lyly publicly claimed that the Queen had signaled to him since 1585 that he could expect to be appointed master of the revels. Lyly wrote angry letters and protested loudly again and again that he was to be passed over. It worked, at least partially. Elizabeth never made it formal that Bach would hold the position. This did not happen until 1603 by James I after his accession to the throne. The new king took a general liking to the English intellectual. He knighted Bach and made him a member of his privy chamber. This may be related to the fact that Bach, who also tried his hand at poetry, as I have already mentioned, wrote a poem to honor the royal ancestors of the new monarch. In his new role as master of the revels, Bach also discussed directly with Shakespeare on several occasions. It is not known whether they have ever talked about Richard III. In any case, the historian was now very interested in the Yorkist King. Bach was not able to begin his work on Richard until after Elizabeth's death. With the change of dynasties from the Tudors to the Stuarts in 1603, the previous constraints of defending the previous ruling house were removed. Already in 1605 he published a work breaking with the orthodox view of Richard. Bach, despite the title he chose for his work, wrote what was in principle the early form of a legal opinion regarding the allegations against Richard. In this way, he avoided the problem of having almost only a hostile source base at his disposal. As an example for his contents, he refused Perkin Warbeck's confession since it was gained by the means of torture, which was never legal in England. However, the English intellectual was not satisfied to work within the limitation to the current catalogue of sources and independently researched further testimonies. These efforts were successful. It was Bach who found the Titulus Regius and the Croyland Chronicle. In this way he was able to show that Richard's accession to the throne had been approved by Parliament. He made both sources available to the public. After completing the first draft of his book, which convincingly demonstrated that Richard could not be found legally guilty of any of the charges, something bizarre happened. For centuries, Bach's name as an academic would be unjustly tarnished. After his death, the manuscript fell into the hands of his great-nephew. He changed it massively and published it as his own work in 1646. A year later, a second issue was released, which was heavily riddled with errors as well. Not even 50% of the new book was the original text. Unfortunately, the great-nephew, who not for the first time tried to present someone else's work as his own work, did not work as precisely and conscientiously as Bach. The new manuscript was correspondingly full of errors and untenable claims. The altered text is still freely accessible today and problematically is often still cited today when people want to refer to Bach. To make matters even worse, the manuscript eventually found its way to the Cotton Library and burned to the corners by fire in 1731. Inevitably, the question arises as to how the manuscript could have fallen into the hands of the great-nephew in the first place. Responsible for this is the dramatic end of the life of the Master of the Revels. In March 1622, Bach became incapacitated due to an unknown illness and had to resign office. A month later, he was declared insane. He died in October of that year. His nephew, Stephen Bach, presented a will that made him and his son, the great-nephew in question, sole heirs. This last will and testament was almost certainly a forgery, or was only created after Bach had already been declared insane. His original will dated back to 1612. Bach left everything to his brother Robert. A servant to the Master of the Revels for 16 or 17 years testified in 1623 that Bach wanted his kinsman to get everything, but he complained several times about his nephew Stephen. Him and his son were even arrested because of the alleged forgery. This accusation was made public in court by Robert's lawyer in November 1624. The brother won in court. But the manuscript was in the hands of the great-nephew long enough, with fatal consequences for the academic reputation of the actual author, as he was blamed for the mistakes because it was not known how much his great-nephew had changed the text. This was particularly unfair because Bach had wrote several more books and was praised for his excellent work with the sources. Bach's reputation would not be restored until 1979. Arthur Kincaid, with the support of the Richard III Society, published the original text of the work. In doing so, he was able to show how conscientiously the original author had worked. Kincaid was able to find 93 of the 100 sources Bach had cited as the basis for his remarks. For the fact that this search did not happen until 360 years later, this achievement is remarkable. The 100 sources used are also a considerable large basis for a work from the 17th century. Bach's work therefore deserves not only trust but also recognition. The 1979 republication also noticeably changed the discourse. It is widely accepted that according to the legal principles of the time, Richard cannot be convicted with the information known to us. Since then, we therefore talk about the plausibility of Richard's guilt or categorize between legal and moral guilt. For many Ricardians, this does not go far enough, but the fact that it has come to this point at all can be considered a great success for Bach, Kincaid, and last but not least, themselves. It is unfortunate that the great-nephew's greed for profit and recognition delayed this process for centuries. Parts of this video are also part of a larger documentary about the Ricardians. This very video you are watching right now presents much more information about Bach, but if you are interested in the history of the Ricardians and other important authors of the movement, the almost 1 hour long documentary is recommended. It's best to subscribe to the channel now, so you don't miss it. And if you want to give me a like, I would be very grateful and happy about that too. Thank you. Bye.